Some time ago we made note of the fact that there is a discrepancy between the actual facts of human origins and the truncated tale in the Bible. But we also made note that the monotheism that has arisen from Israel, and then taken on board wholly by the Christians, is not totally an error either. Here is what we mean. Looking first at the facts, we as human beings were created in a lab by creatures much greater than us. When we became self-aware during this process, we acknowledged the greatness of the creatures that created us, and we called them gods. A perfectly natural and understandable thing to do. They were our Creator, Lord and Master. They were what they were, and humanity did not know the difference between a good God and a bad God. It was later in retrospect that we were able to recognize the idea of goodness, and to what extent the gods that we knew measured up to the standard. But beyond that, we were able to think about good and evil, and again beyond that, we were able to construct the idea of ultimate good and ultimate evil. Several years ago, Jordan Peterson, in his lectures on the Bible, began by discussing the nature of humanity and God, and in particular, the problem of human consciousness. To him, all of our ideas of God are rooted in our consciousness. This includes the move from polytheism to monotheism. In a sense, although I think Jordan Peterson would deny it, he was saying that God is a creation of the human mind. I would suggest that this is backwards. He has the right substrate, but the order is reversed. We are the creation of a mind. Many of us have heard the expression, all is mind. It is true. But here is Jordan Peterson to elaborate on the importance of consciousness.
The stumbling block for a purely objective view of the world seems to me to be consciousness. And consciousness has all sorts of strange properties. For example, it isn't obvious what constitutes time, or at least duration, in the absence of consciousness. And it isn't also easy to understand what constitutes being in the absence of consciousness, because it seems to be the case, well, if a movie is running and there's no one to watch it, I know it sounds like the tree in the forest idea, but it's not that idea at all. If a movie is running and no one's watching it, in what sense can you say that there's even a movie running? Because the movie seems to be the experience of the movie, not the objective elements of the movie. And there's something about the world, at least insofar as we're in it as human beings, that is dependent on conscious experience of the world. Now, of course, you can take consciousness out of the world and say, well, if none of us were here, if there was no such thing as consciousness, then the cosmos would continue running the way it is running. But of course, it depends on what exactly you mean by the cosmos when you make a statement like that, because there's something about the subjective experience of reality that gives it reality. Or at least that's one way of looking at it. Now, and it's deeper than that, it's a deeper idea than that, because there are physicists, and they're not trivial physicists like John Wheeler, who believes that in some sense consciousness plays a constitutive role in transforming the chaotic potential of being into the actuality of being. And he actually thinks about it, he's not alive anymore, but he actually thought about it as playing a constitutive role, And then from the neurobiological perspective, or from the scientific perspective, it's like consciousness is not something we understand. I don't think we understand it at all. It's something we can't get a handle on with our fundamental materialist philosophy. And I don't know why that is. It's quite frustrating if you're a scientist, but it isn't clear to me that we've made any progress whatsoever in understanding consciousness, even though, well, we've been trying to understand it for hundreds of years, and even though psychologists and neurobiologists and so forth have really put a lot of effort into understanding consciousness from a scientific perspective in the last 50 years. So
we will agree with Jordan Peterson that consciousness is very important. We will call it mind.
I think we really underestimate the degree to which consciousness is both, say, miraculous and not understood. I mean, you have what appears to be an entirely material substrate, yet here you are, aware and self-aware and able to generate the world merely in some sense by looking at it. It really is remarkable, and that consciousness is dependent on something that wells up from deep within that material substrate that we don't understand at all. It's really a crazily remarkable thing, and you hear a lot about scientific reductionism, but I'll tell you something that's kind of interesting, and it's a tangent too. The guy that discovered DNA, I think it was Watson, and it's Watson and Crick, but I don't remember who wrote this book, but one of them, I don't remember which one. He believed that DNA was so complicated that it had to come from space. He didn't believe it could have possibly evolved on Earth. And so, like a lot of these people who are used as exemplars of scientific reductionism aren't like that at all when you actually read what they had to say, right? They were very aware of the limits of their own knowledge. And I mean, DNA is something really quite spectacularly remarkable. It's an eternal substance. It's been around for a very long time, and the idea that we understand it is a very stupid idea.
That is fascinating. Our life essence came from space. It is ironic that it is really true, yet Dr. Peterson only mentions it in passing. In fact, if we go back to the mingling of the waters when Tiamat was first hit by Nibiru and its moons, we find the source of the DNA on planet Earth, the planet that is the remnant of Tiamat. That source was Nibiru. But of course, that just pushes back the origins of DNA, the origins of the substrate of consciousness that Peterson talks about. It doesn't explain it. How did life get on board the planet Nibiru? These specific, scientific, material questions about the origins of DNA, we cannot answer in that way. What we can do is give the greater context, the source of all life, all matter, all being. It will then make sense in the context of Peterson's discussion. In a way, this was the context in which Enlil objected to the creation of humanity, the Adamu. Creating life was not specifically the problem. The problem was creating consciousness. This is why Peterson's discussion is so pertinent and so relevant. There is something there that even the Anunnaki did not fully understand, but they did acknowledge that creating the creature that would be the home for consciousness was the prerogative of God, the God that even the Anunnaki recognized was above them. And so this is the God that we are really seeking to know. The gods, the Anunnaki, are a red herring in all of this, and their involvement in our creation must be separated out from the creation of the universe. That God is the one we wish to understand. Jordan Peterson is adept at showing how our minds are capable of creating those superlative concepts that we touched on in another video. Omnipotence, omnipresence, omniscience. Yet when confused with the agents of our birth and peculiar DNA on this planet, we lose sight of the goal, I think. That is my issue with the following discussion of the image and likeness of God. Actually, the image and likeness of the gods, to be precise.
Then there's the idea too, of course, that's deeply embedded in the first chapters of Genesis, which is a staggering idea, you know, and certainly not one that's likely, that human beings were made in the image of God, both male and female were made in the image of God. And that's, of course, a very difficult thing to understand, partly because the God that's referred to in those chapters has a kind of polytheistic element, although it's an element that's moving rapidly towards a unified monotheism. But when people become self-conscious, at least that's how it looks to me, they get thrown out of paradise and then they're in history. And history is a place where there's pain in childbirth and where you're dominated by your mate and where you have to toil like mad, like no other animal, because you're aware of the future. You have to work and sacrifice the joys of the present for the future constantly, and you know you're going to die, and you have all that weight on you. And human beings seem to exist in a post-cataclysmic world. And you know, you can say that we're just like ants on this little trivial planet out on the edge of one of 100 million galaxies, and that what's happening here has no cosmic significance. But that's an arbitrary proposition, you know. I mean, we're very complicated things, and whatever's going on this planet has to do with conscious reality. And the transformations of consciousness, for all we know, might be the most important things that happen everywhere. There's no reason to consider consciousness a trivial phenomenon. I mean, it's taken 3.5 billion years for you to develop the brain that you've developed, and human beings are amazing creatures. I'm very loath to assume that the transformations of consciousness that are described in the early stories in the biblical accounts are somehow cosmically trivial. It doesn't strike me that way, and it's certainly not self-evident.
Indeed, not cosmically trivial at all. But I think we can understand this. It is not really all that mysterious, if we start from the right point. Let us take that statement that we have heard once in a while over the years. All is mind. Let's say it again. All is mind. We have been inclined to ignore it or dismiss it, because it doesn't fit the paradigm that Peterson is struggling with. The concept is simple. We have been laboring under the idea that Peterson espouses here. He is grappling with the unlikelihood of the idea, yet states explicitly that it took millions of years for us to develop the mind that we have. Here he is arguing back and forth between the Christian idea and the evolutionary idea, not realizing both ideas begin with the same premise. That premise is this: mind arises out of the material world. At best it is infused into the existing material world. This is a variation that is found within the Christian tradition. But either way, the premise is backward. The premise instead should be the following: the material world and all that is in it arises from mind. Mind comes first. That is the reason for the saying, all is mind. We will look at the details and explanations of this point of view in another installment. Suffice to say, at this point we will just give the minimum timeline. The God that we are seeking, the God of the superlatives, that God does indeed exist. Indirectly, we were created by that God because everything that exists was and is created by that God. Indeed, we can call that God the All. The reason we can call God the All is because everything that exists is within the All. In fact, going one step further, everything exists within the mind of the All. We will not go any further in this post except to use a contemporary example. Most of us have heard people talking about something that they desire. Something, some money, some relationship, a myriad of possible things that they want or wish for. And lately we have heard much talk about a way of getting those things that the heart desires by a method called manifesting. We might want to say that God manifested the entire universe and all that is in it. The analogy is not exact but is food for thought until next time.